From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Stocks extend a brutal sell-off driven by anxiety over tariffs and growth as President Trump says the economy faces a period of transition and greets tech CEOs at the White House.
Former central banker Mark Carney wins the race to become Canada's next prime minister, just as Ontario raises prices on electricity exports to the U.S. in retaliation against Donald Trump's levies. We'll have more with Ontario's Premier Doug Ford and reaction from U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright.
And House Republicans release a spending bill to keep the government funded through September, but it faces hurdles in both chambers of Congress. Republican Congressman Tim Walberg of Michigan will join us live from Capitol Hill.
Thanks for being with us on the late edition of Balance of Power. We begin this Monday with today's sell-off. Another down day. Markets experiencing a 3-week stretch now of volatility due to anxiety over tariffs, government firings, leading to a sell-off in the S&P 500 and Nasdaq 100, which saw its worst day since 2022. For more now, we turn to Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick at World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, this is not getting any easier.
It's not getting any easier. It was difficult before even the inauguration. Concerns about a potential slowdown in earnings growth, but the chaos in Washington, Joe, has really thrown a wrench in everything. We had one of our worst days on the S&P 500 since the fall, a worst day on the Nasdaq 100. If you can believe this, going back to 2022. And a lot of this, Joe, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from our colleague in Washington, Ed Harrison, Trump finally said the quiet part out loud, and that's a lot of the policies that he's implementing right now. He's okay if it does a little bit of economic damage. He talked about an economic transition. Scott Bessent last week on CNBC talked about this idea of a detox and how MAGA does not stand for Make M&A Great Again. This does seem to be a White House, at least if you take them at face value, Joe, that does seem to be pointing a little bit more towards the long game and trying to ignore some of these short-term market moves. But these short-term market moves are significant, not just the 3% drop that we had today, Joe, but you go back basically to about February 21st. Basically, the idea here that this is a market that's been on the back foot since, down 10% on the Nasdaq, 6-7% on the S&P since then.
Well, and when you look at some of these individual stocks, Romaine, Tesla down 15%. On the day. I can't imagine Elon Musk is super thrilled about that, even as his focus seems to be elsewhere on the Department of Government Efficiency.
Well, how about 54% since that all-time high on Tesla back in mid-December? And more importantly, Kaylee, we get this idea that, you know, the folks in Trump's inner circle, meaning the billionaires, you know, the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Elon Musk, they were supposed to be benefiting from all this. And at least in the short term, they're getting killed. I mean, Elon Musk alone, his net worth has dropped by about $148 billion, basically going back to January 17th, so that last trading day before the inauguration. Remember, that was on the upswing, and don't cry for him just yet, Kaylee. He's still worth a lot of money still. But there's this idea here that this isn't just about everybody else getting hurt. Right now, everybody is feeling the pain, and the big question is, how much longer is the White House willing to let this continue, and is there truly indeed some sort of long economic plan in this that maybe we should be looking to?
Yeah, are they still going to consider tariffs the most beautiful word in the dictionary? Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you very much. Now, as markets are bracing, Canada is also bracing for higher tariffs, an immediate challenge for Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England, who is set to take over as the country's prime minister after winning the race to succeed Justin Trudeau. During his victory speech yesterday, Carney had this sharp message for President Trump on trade.
The Canadian government has rightly retaliated and is rightly retaliating with our own tariffs that will have maximum impact in the United States and minimum impact here in Canada. My government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect.
And we did see further retaliation today with Ontario Premier Doug Ford ordering a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to 3 U.S. states. And Premier Ford is joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Premier Ford, thank you for your time. You have suggested that this surcharge could be hiked or potentially that electricity exports to the U.S. could be cut off entirely if there is escalation from this administration. What escalation would precipitate that response from you?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on, Kaylee and Joe. I appreciate the opportunity. I start off with every interview saying we love Americans. We love the U.S. Canadians love Americans. I do. Spent 20 years of my life in Chicago and New Jersey. In saying this, this is one person. It's not the American people. It's not even Republicans that I've talked to, governors or senators or congresswomen and men. Is one person, that's President Trump, has created this chaos, not just here in Canada and the U.S. and Mexico, but around the world right now. You know, he ran on a mandate to lower inflation, create more jobs, and it's done the total opposite. Inflation's going up. Assembly plants will close if he continues on with these tariffs in the auto sector. People will lose their jobs. Manufacturing will go down, and people will have less money in their pockets. I believe in an Amcan fortress. Let's create an American-Canadian fortress and have the strongest, wealthiest, most prosperous two countries in the entire world. That's what I believe in.
Have you talked about your own retaliation with incoming Prime Minister Carney? Are you both on the same page on this?
I just got off the phone with him a minute ago, and Prime Minister-elect Carney, extremely bright individual when it comes to finances and other areas of business. I'm going to be sitting down with him this week and having a conversation. But he's right in line with what I believe in. Across the country, patriotism is running wild like I've never seen before. And again, it's not against the American people. It's one person. I call it the self-inflicted potential recession. There's one person that will put us in a recession, and that's President Trump.
So you've spoken with the incoming prime minister. Have you had a chance to speak with the president or anyone in this administration since putting into place this surcharge today?
No, I haven't. I spoke to Secretary Lutnick, another bright individual when it comes to finances. And I agree or disagree with President Trump. He's an extremely bright business person. If they can't see this, when the market speaks, I always say when the market speaks, you have to listen. The market is speaking. CEOs are speaking. People are speaking out. Why is he doing this to his largest customer in the world, Canada? No one buys more products off the U.S. than Canada does, including autos, 400% more than Mexico, 200% more than anywhere in the world. And we buy as many cars as we ship down there. And the ones we ship down there are 50% American-made parts. You can't, I always say that you can't unscramble an egg that's been around since the 1960s, the auto pack. We have to make a larger omelet. That's what we need to do.
Well, you're export tariffing electricity here. You've called for possibly export tariffing crude. I wonder, what is your message to Premier Smith of Alberta, who is staunchly opposed to that idea?
Well, that's strictly up to Premier Smith. I have no jurisdiction in Alberta. That will be up to Premier Smith. But Americans have to remember, President Trump, I should say, President Trump should remember that Alberta ships 4.3 million barrels a day down to the U.S. And there's nothing more than I'd want to do is send more energy, more critical minerals, rather than raise tariffs. I don't believe in protectionism with your two closest friends and allies in the entire world. As we're going back and forth at each other, China's ramping up every single day in the critical minerals, and they've cut the U.S. off for any critical minerals for their military. We have it. Ontario has more critical minerals than anywhere in the world. And who do I want to give it to? I want to give it to our closest friends and allies, the U.S.
Well, when we're considering what commodities Ontario does have, you've threatened to cut off the supply of nickel from mines in Ontario. Is that a real threat? And again, what would make you act on that? What action from the Trump administration would see that response?
Well, 50% of the high-grade nickel, and I emphasize high-grade nickel in the U.S. for their military in their aerospace and manufacturing comes from Ontario. Again, Kaylee, I want to send more nickel, more high-grade nickel, more lithium, more cobalt. We have 33 of the most critical minerals that the whole world wants. I don't want to give them to anyone. I want to give them to our closest friend and allies. That's what I want to do. I want to create that damn can fortress.
This is interesting, and I wonder, Premier, what your thoughts are about President Trump's motivations. What's his obsession, if I can use that word, with Canada? Clearly, we've established that much more fentanyl by many thousands of pounds a year is going through Mexico. Have you heard that message from this White House, what it is that Canada could do to bring these tariffs down?
Well, your guess is as good as mine, Joe, because when the president said tighten up the border, we acted immediately to tighten up the border. I had the DEA in my office, I had the U.S. Border Patrol and Canadian Border Patrol, federal and state police, and we're doing that. We put over 10,000 personnel along our border, but it works both ways. I hate drugs. I can't stand 1 gram of fentanyl coming in, but where's the precursors coming from? From China. They gave me a report, our provincial police, equal to our state police, that hundreds of kilos of cocaine are coming from the southern border that were caught in the last couple of weeks. Illegal guns, illegals, opioids, fentanyl, everything. We have a shared border, and I know our Canadian and American Border Patrol folks work together. Our police work together. So we're going to do everything we can to stop the flow of drugs and illegals and guns coming back and forth across the border. But it has dropped drastically here in Canada.
Well, President Trump contends it's not just an issue with what's flowing over the border. This is also about making sure trade between the U.S. and Canada is more fair, hence the threat of reciprocal tariffs against things like lumber and dairy. Premier, should Canada consider lowering rates charged there so that it doesn't require a reciprocal tariff?
Well, Kaylee, I'll tell you the facts. You take the oil off the balance sheet because the U.S. needs it. The U.S. has a $56 billion surplus on manufacturing and services with Canada. So they have a surplus of $56 billion. I have no problem with that. That's fine. Let's grow the pie. As I say, grow the omelet, make it larger. As as our foes, be it China, is declaring an economic war. They've been doing that, by the way, quietly for the last 10 years while everyone's been sleeping. And they're sitting back laughing at the 2 greatest allies, duking it up back and forth. It's unacceptable. Let's unite. We're stronger together. United we stand, divided we fall. We need to stand united together.
Thanks for joining us. Doug Ford, Ontario's Premier. Great to have you with us on Balance of Power. We should also note that Mark Carney is the former chair of Bloomberg's board of directors. Coming up on Balance of Power, House Republicans unveil a funding bill to avoid a shutdown at the end of this week. We've got details ahead from Republican Congressman Tim Walberg of Michigan. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think we'll see very little dissent. There's no appetite out there, and there should never be appetite to shut the federal government down. It costs more money to reopen, it hurts people, it puts our nation at risk. So I sincerely believe that we will pass this CR and that the Senate will take it up and pass it as well.
Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischmann of Tennessee on the early edition of Balance of Power, expressing confidence about averting a government shutdown after House Republican leaders unveiled a draft funding bill this weekend. And joining us now with the latest from Congress is Bloomberg's Megan Scully, who helps lead our coverage of Capitol Hill. So, Megan, it's not exactly a clean continuing resolution. There's specifically some components of this which Democrats aren't going to like. That's why we have questions about the vote count, knowing you're at least going to need Democrats in the Senate, if not the House, too.
Absolutely. So it's looking like Democrats are holding strong in the House. Obviously we won't know until they actually cast the votes. But in opposing this legislation, Republicans have probably 2 votes to spare. We know Tom Massey is a no. He's usually somebody who stands by his no, as opposed to others who we have seen be persuaded otherwise in the run-up to a vote, particularly when the president gives them a call walking into the chamber. So that leaves them one. And is there that one out there to vote down this bill? It's looking probably not. Definitely not. No one is emerging as the likely one. So then if it does pass, we look to the Senate, and they're going to need 7, maybe 8, because Rand Paul is a no there, to overcome a filibuster, which would be expected. So John Fetterman would be behind it, a Democrat from Pennsylvania. Where are the others? There is not, as the congressman said, there really isn't an appetite in either party for a shutdown. But this bill doesn't do the things that Democrats wanted it to do, namely holding Doge to account, putting some constraints on Elon Musk. It does not do that.
Is it just a different reality, though, for Democrats in the Senate, knowing that that's the vote that would prompt the shutdown? You can get away with a lot in the House right now, but if John Thune needs 8 Democrats, can he find them?
Yeah, so it's one of those things you could sort of fudge it, right? And Susan Collins does this all the time, where you say, well, I voted for the procedure, so I voted to end the filibuster, but then I voted against the legislation, which would only need a 50-vote majority.
I voted for it before I voted against it, Megan?
Yes, so it's a little tap dancing that they like to do. They might be able to find the votes there. If they don't, then what we anticipate is a very short-term CR, something in the order of a week or two, and they try to hash out some kind of a compromise.
Well, I'll tell you, this is going to be interesting to figure out together here with the help of Bloomberg's Megan Scully. Thank you, Megan. For more, we turn to Capitol Hill, talk with someone who's in the middle of all this. Republican Congressman Tim Walberg of Michigan is joining us. Congressman, it's great to have you on Bloomberg TV and radio. The countdown clocks are not on TVs. Nobody seems to think we really are going to shut down. Do we run the risk of sleepwalking into a shutdown on Friday?
Well, I hope not. I don't think we need to. I mean, you just have to go back to December with the CR we're presently under. All the Democrats in the House voted for it. We've changed nothing to speak of other than moving some community projects that we don't want to fund twice and taking some of those dollars and putting them toward things that I would hope that Democrats would want to support, even though Hakeem Jeffries told them this past Friday to vote against the bill. They were very supportive of making sure that bureaucrats were not laid off, but now they're willing to do something even more strongly committed to hurting not only the bureaucrats, but Social Security recipients, Medicare, Medicaid recipients as well. In the end, I think we're going to pass it because, frankly, it's what's needed. It is a true clean CR with just a few revisions in it, using present dollars. But it does what's necessary to keep the government open, keep Medicare recipients receiving what they need, Social Security recipients, Medicaid recipients, and by the way, it also gives the largest pay increase to junior enlisted military in 40 years. And I think that's something that's necessary. And so I believe ultimately we're going to get this out because we got to go to a bigger issue, and that's reconciliation for a tax cut.
Well, Congressman, just quickly following up on your point about Democrats, they argued they would be more supportive of a measure like this if it had constraints on the ability of those in the executive branch, President Trump and Elon Musk, to decide how the appropriated money is actually appropriated. Without that kind of language in this bill, can you guarantee that they will spend it as Congress has outlined?
Well, I guess I need to ask a question first. Would Democrats allowed us to withhold our votes until Biden assured us that he wouldn't spend it the way we didn't want him to spend it? That's ridiculous. They know it is. It's a false argument. What goes on in the White House will be controlled by the President of the United States. And Donald Trump is not a shrinking violet. When he wants to spend something that is appropriated for him, he will do it.
We noticed that, Congressman. We should let our viewers and listeners know that you chair the House Education Committee. And, of course, the president has made no secret about his desire to sunset the Education Department. If he achieves that goal, I guess with or without the help of Congress, will you and the Speaker sunset the Education Committee?
Well, of course, that takes votes again. It takes votes on both sides of the Capitol. And right now, I don't think there are 60 votes to abolish the Department of Education. But the president and my committee and our Ways and Means Committee can do significant things to right-size, to depower certain parts of the Department of Education, to force the bureaucrats who are over there to get things done that really speaks to quality education. And that's what we're going to be committed to with the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon. We've had that conversation. She knows what a TKO or a KO means, and we may have to do some of that. But in the end, it comes as a result of Congress that put the Department of Education in place back in 1979. If we're going to abolish it, it will come through Congress. But I certainly will do what I can to make sure that states have more control. When you get back really to the nub of it, our biggest concern is with the students, the parents, and the teachers. We get those three things working right, regardless of what is in place as far as the department or what laws are in place. We get those things. The student, the parent, and the educator, those things working right, will do just fine.
Well, something that didn't do just fine today, at least if you were long, is the equity market, Congressman. And before we let you go, we just got a statement from the White House talking about a divergence between the animal spirits of the stock market and what's in store for the economy in the medium to long term. What would you tell your constituents that might be looking at their portfolio today or are worried about keeping their job about what they might have to endure in the near term for the sake of that medium to long term?
Well, first I'd say hang on a bit. Take a deep breath. This president has been known to succeed. His last term was very successful. Right now, he has told the people exactly what made 77 million people vote for him, the largest in history, that he would restructure government, he'd right-size it, he would reduce the size of government, and he'd give control back to the people. That is an aggressive act, and there certainly will be some upheaval that takes place. But I think if they bide the course, and take that deep breath and not listen to Democrats that are talking gloom and doom. Remember what we just came through with 4 years of inflation that shouldn't have been there except for government overspending. With what the president is doing around the world as well as the United States, I think in the end, I would bet on his success over what the pundits are talking about.
All right, Republican Congressman Tim Walberg of Michigan, thank you for your time. Now, as I was alluding to, tech stocks specifically experienced their biggest one-day plunge since 2022, with the Nasdaq dropping a bunch today. A big drag was Tesla, suffering its worst day since 2020. And joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg technology reporter Jackie Davalos. So, Jackie, interesting to see moves like this on any day, but especially a day when tech executives go to the White House to meet with the president.
That's exactly right. And that's where really a lot of this uncertainty is actually hanging in. What is going to happen to tariff policy, manufacturing policy? That has big implications for a lot of the chip makers, especially the domestic ones that, of course, President Donald Trump has said he wants to boost. When you look at some of the other names, of course, this is partially related to the broader route we're seeing in the market. But you mentioned a couple names as well that also have their own problems going on. You have Tesla, NVIDIA, Apple's Siri delay. Then you have NVIDIA's concerns about DeepSeek and whether that chip policy is going to dent its sales. And then, of course, Tesla with Elon Musk's politics perhaps denting sales. Those growth prospects are no longer what they were.
So you're looking at a lot of broken charts here in a market that may not actually rebound very quickly. I suppose if the president said he was doing away with all the tariffs, that might make a dent here. But how troubling are the losses in tech to see a round trip like this? Tesla, you mentioned, down 50%, more than that from its peak.
Well, of course, you have to look at what is actually going on with the fundamentals. And I think there are signs that there are weaknesses underlying a lot of the exuberance that we've seen with some of the growth narrative driving the Magnificent Seven stocks. All of those seven were down on the day, including those that you might think are less prone to being vulnerable to, manufacturing or perhaps that trade policy, Meta, the software heavy names. But even as we look at Oracle today, it saw some massive swings after it reported actually, a miss in its third fiscal quarter results. You actually saw investors more excited about its outlook. Then you saw it tank again a little bit, as much as 2 to 3%. But a lot of this will have to hang on what President Trump says about domestic policy as well.
Really great to have you at the table. Thank you so much Coming up, Bloomberg's Alix sitting down with Energy Secretary Chris Wright in Houston. We'll bring you that conversation next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. There are always periods of, it takes a little time.
There's going to be no recession in America. What there's going to be is global tariffs are going to come down. I would never bet on recession. No chance.
Are you worried about a recession? Maria Bartiromo asked you and you kind of hesitated.
I'll tell you what, of course you hesitate. Who knows? All I know is this. We're going to take in hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs, and we're going to become so rich, you're not going to know where to spend all that money, I'm telling you.
President Trump there on Air Force One after we heard from him earlier on Fox on Sunday morning. Then Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick confident on that very same day the U.S. economy would avoid a recession. President Trump, on the other hand, not ruling anything out. Joining us now, Tom Orlik, chief economist at Bloomberg Economics. It's great to see you, Tom. Thanks for coming back to talk to us here. This is clearly a market that was, I guess, taking Donald Trump more seriously than Howard Lutnick over the weekend. How are we already talking about the R word in the administration that was supposed to bring growth?
So it's a great question, Joe. So I think before the inauguration, there were two possible paths that the Trump administration could take. The markets were betting it was going to be like the first term. Tax cuts, good for the markets. Regulation cuts, good for the markets. And a bunch of talk about tariffs, but really not enough to move the dial. The second possibility, and I think that is the world that we've realized we are now in, is that Trump would actually attempt to deliver on some of the sweeping reforms that he identified on the campaign trail. Huge tariff increases, huge spending cuts. Now, they might be the long-term solutions, a U.S. economy with a big trade deficit and rising debt needs. But I think what the markets are telling us today is before you get there, there's going to be some significant short-term costs.
Well, and we keep hearing on this program, Tom, that this is a negotiating tactic, that not all of these tariffs are going to be implemented. He's just trying to extract concessions from whatever trading partner it is that we're talking about. But is this not already impacting business and consumer decision-making in a way that will show up in the economy, regardless of whether or not the levies actually go into place for an extended period of time?
So I think that's a great question, Kayleigh. And when it comes to tariffs as a negotiating tool, I think we need to think about the difference between big countries and small countries. Let's think about Colombia. Colombia refused to accept migrant flights from the United States. Trump said 25% tariffs. Colombia caved. No tariffs went into place. That's where tariffs can really work as a negotiating tool. Now let's think about China. Well, China is now almost as big as the US in economic terms. China doesn't want to be pushed around, so Trump says 20% tariffs as a negotiating tool, and what does President Xi say? Nothing. The tariffs roll on. President Xi knows that this is going to be painful for China, but it's also going to be painful for the US, painful for companies like Apple, painful for companies like Nvidia, and we're seeing that pain reflected in that 4% drop in the Nasdaq today.
Tom, at what point do we start taking the markets more seriously here in Washington, or is this just noise if the markets are overreacting? This is a president known to obsess over Wall Street who says he's not paying attention to the markets right now.
So everyone says they don't pay attention to the market. Everyone really pays attention to the markets.
Yeah.
The example I come back to in my more optimistic moments is the Volcker shock at the beginning of the Reagan era. Reagan came in. Volcker realized that he needed to do something big to bring inflation under control. Interest rates were jacked up. That was really painful. The US suffered soaring unemployment, but it was the right thing to do for the long term. And the rest of Reagan's first term and all of his second term was a period of growth for the US economy. That's what the Trump administration hopes they're going to be delivering. The markets are signaling to them, well, we might get where you want in the long term, but in the short term, there's going to be a price to pay.
All right, Tom Orlik of Bloomberg Economics, thank you so much. Now, earlier this afternoon, our colleague Alix had the chance to sit down with a member of the Trump administration, the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, and asked him about the jitters we're seeing in the market.
I don't know if you've seen, but it is a tough day in the market. Stocks were hit really hard. Oil's off 2%. S&P was off almost 3%. Growth fears and tariff fears directly impacting the market. What do you say?
Look, this president's a businessman. He's a negotiator, not in his career in politics and his career in business. And what has been the end result of that? Improvements for the American people. But we're in the midst of a deal right now. We're in the midst of negotiations. Trump is fighting every day to make conditions, business conditions, cost of living conditions better for Americans. I think that's the trajectory we're on, but you've always got uncertainty on the road there.
There's pain for gain, right? But like how long that pain lasts for can be really tricky, particularly when we're trying to actually invest.
Yeah, look, he's got two big goals on trade. Number one, what we've heard about, I don't think it's been talked about enough, is look, 100,000 or more premature deaths of mostly young Americans from fentanyl. He's massively motivated by that. Anyone who's been touched by a friend or a family friend that's seen a death from fentanyl, this is just heartbreaking. So he's trying to work with both of our neighbor to the south and our neighbor to the north to how can we go as far as we can to shut down the trafficking in fentanyl. I think it's hard to go too far in that direction. The other thing President Trump wants to do is have free trade but fair trade. You've heard him talk about reciprocal tariffs. You know, we have 250% tariffs to export, dairy products into Canada. That doesn't make any sense. That certainly hurts American dairy farmers. So let's have the parties come together and together work to lower tariff barriers together and have reciprocal trade so it's fair to both sides.
All right, let's unpack that for a second. Going first to the trade barrier part, just example, when you have a tax and a tariff on Canadian imports of oil, won't that actually hurt consumers? Because all of a sudden you're going to have refiner margins are going to plummet, then you're going to have higher gasoline prices. Every analyst on the street is saying that.
They might be wrong.
What if they're right? What if they're right? I mean, we don't have that oil in the U.S., right? We don't have heavy oil, so we cannot refine it here.
Yes, it's good for that oil to come into our marketplace, and I suspect that market will continue coming into our marketplace. Okay. So look, there's uncertainty is unsettling, and that leads to a loss of confidence. That leads to fear. But look, life is long. This administration's been in 50 days. We've had 4 actions on LNG exports. We're getting rid of nonsense regulations on home appliances to make them lower cost and higher performing. There's so much positive going on, but yes, you're seeing the sausage making up close and personal. Okay. At the end of the day, we want a lower cost for Americans and expand opportunity for Americans, and I think that's what you'll see coming.
But what if the sausage becomes higher gasoline prices or diesel prices because of the tariffs?
Well, since President Trump was elected and since he was inaugurated, you've seen a decline in oil prices and a decline in gasoline prices. You saw them decline further today.
This is true. They're down about 17% oil prices since the peak back in January. But on the flip side, if I'm a driller, how do I drill more? Because I don't want to drill when oil's at 69.
So President Trump's worked hard to lower the cost of doing business in the United States. We had 4 years in the Biden administration where there was so many barriers and you never knew where the next one was coming. You can't get a permit on federal land. You can't build a gathering line. You can't, maybe you're not going to be able to export your natural gas. I don't want to drill if I'm not sure where it's going to go. We had all those things that artificially chilled investment, which means the break-even prices for the companies goes higher and higher. Trump's longer-term agenda is make it easier to invest in America, lower cost to produce oil, natural gas, electricity, manufactured products, everything in the United States. So I think you're going to see a lowering of the break-even, a lowering in the threshold at which it no longer makes sense to drill. But supply and demand will dictate prices for sure.
Sure. But on the flip side, if you have tariffs coming in on aluminum and steel, that will raise the break-even prices per well drilled.
Two motivations there. Number one, we've seen so much exporting of manufacturing jobs in the United States over the last 25 years, mostly to Asia, driven in large part by China. So he has a goal, I think a great goal, to reshore manufacturing in the United States. We can make heavy industry again in this country. But there's a transition time there for sure. But look, he's a negotiator. He's a businessman. He got elected to lower prices for American consumers. Do you think he's going to change his mind and say, no, know I'm in favor of higher prices on American consumers. That's not where this administration's going.
It's just how long the pain will last. I think is really at the heart of the question. And as a CEO, I have not yet to meet a CEO here today that tells me they're going to drill more because they're worried about the uncertainty.
Uncertainty's unsettling. Uncertainty's unsettling.
You know, you were a CEO of an oil company.
Absolutely. But look, you got to give it a little bit of time. We saw the results last time. Trump was in 4 years in his first term, Trump 45. There was a lot of fear there. What happened? Inflation averaged below 2%. Energy prices came down. Wages grew in America, particularly for blue-collar, working-class people. It's the same agenda. It's the same agenda this time.
So let's go to the IRA for a second. You guys are reviewing, of course, what parts of the IRA will stay. Tax credits, everyone I talk to loves the tax credits. They love them. They love them for hydrogen. They love them for wind. They love them for solar. Will you keep those? Will the administration keep them?
Everybody loves to get other people's money, you know, whether it's business or consumers or whatever. But look where that's led us, Alix. Look where that's led us. Almost a $2 trillion deficit in the last year of the Biden administration in peacetime with relatively low unemployment. That's just unsustainable. If you shovel money out the door, everyone can get a sugar high, but you have to pay the piper. So there's, of course, politics, and it's the House and the Senate will decide what from the IRA bill stays and what goes.
Bloomberg's Alix Steele bringing us a great conversation with the new Energy Secretary Chris Wright at CERAWeek in Houston. Coming up, we'll have a look at how the Trump administration is responding to the tariff fallout and the administration's plans to cut spending. Yes, the Doge, our signature panel. On the way next on the Monday edition of Balance of Power, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will be with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Frankly, I can't believe I'm here doing this. It's kind of bizarre, but I kind of think that we've got this enormous federal budget deficit, and it's a $2 trillion deficit. It keeps growing. Our interest payments are higher than our Defense Department budget. That's I think was the real wake-up call for me.
Elon Musk on Fox Business earlier this afternoon talking about his current role in the administration. And joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is our signature panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Jeannie Shanzano, Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome to you both. Jeannie, in that interview, Elon Musk told Larry Kudlow when he was talking about his concern about the U.S. potentially going bankrupt that entitlements need to be cut, Social Security and Medicare, which is something that the president himself has said should not be touched. This, of course, after last week with Donald Trump reportedly telling cabinet officials that it's up to them to implement cuts, not up to Elon Musk. Do you sense any trouble in paradise here?
I absolutely do, if only because we are hearing mixed messages out of this administration. You know, it wasn't long ago that we were critiquing Joe Biden's administration for mixed messages. And here's Donald Trump. You've got a commerce secretary saying absolutely no recession. The president saying, he can't say no to that idea. You've got Elon Musk talking about the need to cut entitlements. And by the way, he is mathematically correct on that. And yet you've got a president who not only has taken that off the table, but said, I want to give more tax cuts. And so, the messaging from this administration, and we talk about Donald Trump as this great communicator, and he is in some ways, but the mixed messages are doing a huge and enormous harm to them politically and to the markets and the economy.
What are your thoughts on this? Rick, the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is out talking growth. We're not going to have a recession. Donald Trump won't rule one out. Elon Musk just talked about keeping America from going bankrupt. Which one is it?
Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Believe me.
I don't know.
But is Elon Musk a Democrat? I mean, who has done more damage to the Trump administration since the inaugural than Elon Musk? Wow. I mean, he has inflamed Republican constituencies all over the country over his cuts in their pet projects. Mm-hmm. He's alienated Republicans on the Hill against the administration, who are frustrated that they have no say. He's single-handedly disrupted the cabinet of the presidents, where they have shouting matches at the first cabinet meeting. I mean, and I actually like the fact that he's trying to cut the growth of federal government. I think that strategy is great. But all of the other things just seem to be undermining the current administration. Not that they are all speaking with a unified voice. They're not. Right. But he certainly stands out as the sort of grinder-in-chief of this administration. If anyone is pointing to a recession, it's Elon Musk.
Well, and then you have his own personal businesses that he's associated with. Tesla stock down more than 15% today, now at the lowest since October. You had a Starship blow up in the airspace last week. You had a cyber attack, at least according to Elon Musk, of X today. Larry Kudlow asked him, Rick, how hard it is to run his businesses while doing this Doge work. He says he's doing it with great difficulty. At some point, does this become unsustainable when we're talking about key man risk in so many different areas, including perhaps in the Department of Government Efficiency?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that the fact that Larry Kudlow brought it up in the interview, kudos to him, because it's like what every investor in Tesla and Starlink and SpaceX would be asking, right? What are you doing in X? What are you doing to make our companies and our investments secure at a time when the markets overall are really pressured? And so I think it's a legitimate question. I mean, look, it's not outside the strategy to have starships blowing up. That's how they learn what they're doing. But the reality is that all of those businesses are stressed right now, not least of which because of the macro environment that has been created by the Trump administration being all over the map on things like tariffs and this whole issue of growth that you talk about. Where's the evidence? I mean, we're seeing job loss. Immigration, by deporting all these folks, you're taking a cap on growth, and obviously the trade policy is also exacerbating that. So I mean, it's very unnerving for Republicans all over town to see this current outcome.
What's happening to Tesla's brand right now, Jeannie? What do you make of this? The stock is down over 50% from its recent high following the election of Donald Trump, down by more than half. We saw protests over the weekend at some Tesla dealerships, if I can call them that. You've got celebrities posting on their getting rid of Tesla cars. How much of this concern about sales has to do with politics?
It looks like much of it. And, the reality is that in these 6 weeks, we have learned that while Elon Musk is a brilliant businessman and he is really, really good at making money, his political acumen is probably not all that it's cracked up to be. And so, Donald Trump, of course, needed him to help him fund his campaign and to reach a large audience, and he has done that. But putting him in charge and up front in terms of these Doge cuts has been something of a disaster. And I think, one of the visions that will go down after all of this and will stay with us is the vision of him holding up that chainsaw. And even Donald Trump is saying, no more chainsaws. We're not going to do that anymore. So it is bad politics. And that's what Rick was just talking about. It's bad politics for the Republicans. It's bad politics for Donald Trump. And Steve Bannon, of all people, has been screaming this from the rafters. And he's right. Even if you don't like Steve Bannon, his political sort of sense is accurate on this one.
It just strikes me that we just got a second statement out from the White House about some of the market activity we saw today. Jeannie, this one in part reads, President Trump delivered historic job, wage, and investment growth in his first term and is set to do so again in his second term. But are you surprised we haven't heard from the man himself who, at least in his first term, so frequently touted the stock market? Where is he in defense of U.S. exceptionalism and equity prices?
Yeah, it is stunning. I mean, he's out talking about everything except the numbers and except the reality. And I think what we're seeing is Donald Trump really wants to use this tariff policy he's been so long committed to. But the reality of the market and so much else, consumer sentiment, all of these numbers, is telling him that he shouldn't. And so I almost feel we're watching, the inside of Donald Trump fight with itself. Should I or shouldn't I? We've seen this back and forth, and it continues to go on. I think at some point he will pull the plug on it, but I think he's probably wrestling with that in the White House this very minute, so he doesn't want to come out and talk about that at the very least.
What do you make of this? Somebody decided today we need to kick out a statement after the markets close. Rick, this is a White House spokesman, to Kaylee's point, not the president, who says President Trump delivered historic job, wage, and investment growth in his first term and is set to do so again in his second term. Do we not need a little more than that?
Yeah, that really doesn't address anything that happened this week or last week with the markets. And well, you could make an argument that the last thing the White House should be doing is talking about the markets. I mean, what goes up goes down and back and forth. We used to complain all the time about Joe Biden not talking about the record markets that he had. I mean, he had good news to talk about and wouldn't do it. So I don't blame him for sort of being a little bit sketchy. I mean, honestly, I'd prefer the White House not to get into the ups and downs of the markets. But that's not the case.
Well, we'll keep tabs on this. Maybe he'll speak about it tomorrow. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you so much. Our great panel to get us started on this Monday. Coming up, U.S. and Ukrainian officials are set to meet in Saudi Arabia to discuss initial ceasefire agreements, at least possible agreements with Russia. We'll look ahead to those conversations next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Well, we just about have. I mean, we really just about have. And we want to do anything we can to get Ukraine to be serious about getting something done. You know, I say they don't have the cards. Nobody really has the cards. Russia doesn't have the cards. They don't have them. What you have to do is you have to make a deal.
President Trump on Air Force One yesterday talking with reporters, announcing, if you had trouble hearing on the radio, he's largely lifted the freeze on U.S. intelligence sharing with Ukraine. This comes as officials from both countries are set to meet in Saudi Arabia to discuss the timing and scope of an initial ceasefire with Russia. Kaylee, Secretary of State Marco Rubio set to lead those talks tomorrow.
Alongside National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, we'll be keeping you apprised of that tomorrow, plus what's expected in Congress. The House could vote on a continuing resolution to fund the government passed this weekend. And you'll have more coverage of that in the Washington edition newsletter you can find on the terminal and online.
We'll see you back here tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.